Welcome back to A World of History, where we dive into the lives and legacies of the figures who shaped our world. Today, we're continuing our journey through the extraordinary life of Napoleon Bonaparte, a man whose ambition seemed boundless and whose genius rewrote the rules of power in Europe. If you're just joining us, don't worry, we'll get you up to speed. In our last episode, we talked about Napoleon's humble beginnings on the windswept island of Corsica. Far from the glittering halls of Paris, Napoleon's childhood was shaped by the island's rugged terrain, family pride, and a thirst for opportunity. Even as a boy, he was ambitious, determined to escape his small world upbringing and make a name for himself. Spoiler alert, he did just that. But how does a boy from a modest Corsican family become one of the most powerful men in Europe? The answer lies in timing, talent, and the ability to thrive in chaos. Let's set the scene. It's the late 18th century, and France is falling apart. The year is 1789, and the French Revolution has erupted like a volcano, spewing discontent and unrest across the nation. Why? Well, decades of terrible financial management had left France broke. King Louis XVI had borrowed and spent wildly, trying to play catch-up with Europe's superpowers. His lavish court at Versailles, with its endless parties, gold-encrusted everything, and Marie Antoinette's infamous spending sprees, was the ultimate symbol of excess. Meanwhile, regular people were starving. Bread riots broke out, taxes were crushing, and the nobility, who should have been pitching in to save the country, refused to pay a single coin. The frustration boiled over into revolution. And we're not talking about a polite reshuffling of power. Heads rolled, literally, and the monarchy was dismantled. What followed was a period of political chaos, violence, and uncertainty. Imagine living in a country where leaders changed as often as the weather, and nobody seemed to know who was in charge. Enter Napoleon. This young, ambitious military officer saw the chaos not as a disaster, but as an opportunity. He had already made a name for himself as a brilliant strategist and fearless leader in the army. But Napoleon wasn't content to just win battles. He wanted more. He wanted control. During the revolution, Napoleon made his move. Through a combination of charm, boldness, and pure political genius, he staged a coup d'état. He became one of 3 consuls, a role that gave him immense power. But let's be honest, Napoleon didn't share the spotlight well. It wasn't long before everyone knew who the real leader was. Let's fast forward to December 2nd, 1804, the grandeur of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Thousands of eyes fixed on a single man, and that man, a self-made emperor who had clawed his way from Corsica's rugged shores to the pinnacle of power. Now, let's set the stage. This wasn't just a coronation. Oh no, Napoleon didn't do anything halfway. This was a spectacle, a message, a power move for the ages. Traditionally in Europe, coronations symbolized divine right, the idea that kings were chosen by God and anointed by the church. But Napoleon? He tossed that idea straight out the window. This was a man of the revolution, remember, where power to the people was the rallying cry. So when the big moment came, Napoleon didn't kneel for the Pope to place the crown on his head. Nope. He grabbed that crown and placed it on himself. Bold? Yes. Shocking? Absolutely. Symbolic? You bet. By crowning himself, Napoleon was telling the world, I made myself emperor. My power doesn't come from the heavens. It comes from my talent, my ambition, and my victories. And oh yeah, from the people of France. It was a declaration of independence, not just from monarchies of old, but from the church itself. The event itself was a feast for the senses. Almost 10,000 guests packed into Notre Dame, all decked out in their finest. Nobles, dignitaries, military heroes, they were all there, and every detail was designed to dazzle. Napoleon's robes were nothing short of majestic. A crimson velvet cloak embroidered with golden bees, a nod to his link to ancient rulers. And then there was Josephine, his wife and soon-to-be empress, wearing a gown so resplendent it could have made a goddess jealous. But let's talk about the Pope, Pope Pius VII, who was brought all the way to Paris for this ceremony. Poor guy. He probably thought he was going to play a key role, like popes traditionally did in coronations. Instead, he ended up as a glorified spectator. Sure, he gave a blessing, but Napoleon made it clear that he was the star of the show. Even in Jacques-Louis David's famous painting of the event, which we'll get to in a moment, the Pope is sitting to the side, almost looking like an afterthought. And then there was the crowning itself. First, Napoleon crowned himself, sending a loud and clear message. Then, in a moment of unexpected tenderness, he crowned Josephine. Imagine her kneeling, her head bowed as Napoleon gently placed the crown on her. It wasn't just an act of love, it was a declaration that their dynasty had begun. Now let's talk about the masterpiece that captured this moment for eternity, Jacques-Louis David's The Coronation of Napoleon. If you haven't seen it, do yourself a favor and look it up. It's a behemoth of a painting, over 6 meters high and 10 meters wide. This wasn't just a painting, it was propaganda, designed to showcase Napoleon's grandeur and rewrite history on his terms. At the center, you see Napoleon standing tall and confident, holding the crown above Josephine's head. The golden light seems to radiate from him, emphasizing his power and authority. Around him, the audience is a sea of opulence. Officials, soldiers, and nobles, all painted in stunning detail. Every thread, every jewel, every facial expression is captured with precision. But here's where it gets really interesting. The little tweaks David made to the truth. For instance, Napoleon's mother, Letizia Bonaparte, is prominently featured in the audience, looking regal and composed. In reality, she wasn't even there. She boycotted the ceremony, unhappy about Josephine. But Napoleon wanted to present a picture of family unity, so there she is, sitting front and center, whether she liked it or not. And the Pope? He's sitting quietly off to the side, almost blending into the background. Napoleon wanted everyone to know that the church wasn't calling the shots here. He was. There's even a cameo by the artist himself. Look closely, and you'll see Jacques-Louis David tucked away, painting the scene as if to say, history is being made here, and I'm the one recording it. When Napoleon placed that imperial crown on his head, it wasn't just a ceremony, it was a statement. He wasn't a king in the traditional sense, with his power handed down through generations of royal bloodlines. No, Napoleon's authority was self-made, built on revolutionary ideals, military brilliance, and a shrewd understanding of how to wield power. But as you might guess, the crowned heads of Europe weren't exactly thrilled. To them, Napoleon was more than a rival. He was a walking, talking threat to everything they stood for. France, under Napoleon, wasn't just a military powerhouse, it was a beacon of revolutionary ideas, a challenge to the old aristocratic order. Naturally, the great powers, Britain, Austria, and Russia, weren't going to sit back and let Napoleon redraw the map of Europe unopposed. They regrouped, forged alliances, and prepared to strike. Let's set the stage. Napoleon had barely gotten comfortable in his new imperial digs when the monarchies of Europe came knocking. They formed coalitions, alliances born out of desperation, to crush this upstart emperor. But what they faced was a commander unlike any they'd ever seen. Napoleon wasn't just a military leader. He was a strategist, a tactician, and frankly, a genius. His campaigns during these years are the stuff of legend. Let's take a closer look at some of his most dazzling victories. In 1805, we have the Battle of Ulm. Imagine this. An Austrian army is marching confidently, thinking they've got the upper hand. But Napoleon doesn't wait for them to strike. Instead, he moves with lightning speed, surrounding and outmaneuvering them. In less than a month, 50,000 Austrian troops surrender without even a major battle. It's not just a victory, it's a masterpiece of maneuver warfare. In the same year, 1805, we have the Battle of Austerlitz. Austerlitz, the crown jewel of Napoleon's military career. This is the Battle of the Three Emperors, where Napoleon faces the combined might of Austria and Russia. The odds are stacked against him, but Napoleon has a plan. He feigns weakness, lures his enemies into a trap, and then unleashes a devastating counterattack. The result? Total victory. Austerlitz isn't just a win, it's a showcase of Napoleon's ability to think 3 steps ahead. And in 1806, we have the famous battles of Jena and Auerstedt. Next up, Prussia. If you thought they'd learn from Austria's mistakes, think again. Napoleon smashes their outdated tactics with his fast-moving modern army. Within days, he's taken Berlin, and the Prussian military is in shambles. Another battle was the Battle of Friedland, fought in 1807. By now, even the Russians are starting to feel the heat. At Friedland, Napoleon delivers yet another decisive blow, forcing Tsar Alexander I to negotiate. Now, picture this. It's 1807. Napoleon and Tsar Alexander meet on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. It's theatrical, symbolic, pure Napoleon. The resulting Treaty of Tilsit is a moment of triumph for the French emperor. Europe is essentially divided into two spheres of influence. Napoleon rules the West and Alexander takes the East. It's the high watermark of Napoleon's power. At this point, France's borders stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Vistula River. Napoleon is the master of continental Europe. But even as he's savoring his victories, the seeds of future conflict are being sown. The monarchies of Europe may have been humbled, but their resentment is smoldering. Napoleon wasn't just a conqueror, he was a builder too. After crushing Austria and Prussia, he turned his attention to Central Europe. In 1806, he established the Confederation of the Rhine, a coalition of German states under French protection. This wasn't just a political move, it was a symbolic one. By creating the Confederation, Napoleon effectively ended the Holy Roman Empire, a centuries-old institution that represented the old European order. In its place, he built something modern, something that reflected his vision of a united, efficient Europe under French dominance. The Confederation wasn't just a buffer zone, it was a statement of Napoleon's ability to reshape the political landscape. He wasn't just winning battles, he was rewriting history. Napoleon's love for Josephine was legendary. When they first met, she was the sophisticated widow of an executed aristocrat, a woman who captivated him with her elegance and charm. He, on the other hand, was a rising military star, rough around the edges but brimming with ambition. They married in 1796, and Napoleon was utterly smitten, writing her passionate letters that dripped with adoration and longing. But Josephine wasn't quite as enamored. While Napoleon was away on his campaigns, she became entangled in a series of affairs with younger, attractive men, including military officers and high society elites. For Napoleon, who was fiercely loyal to Josephine, at least in the beginning, the betrayal was devastating. When he discovered her infidelity, it shattered his trust and marked a turning point in their relationship. Of course, Napoleon wasn't one to wallow in heartbreak for long. If Josephine's unfaithfulness hurt him, it also gave him permission, at least in his own mind, to indulge in infidelity himself. And indulge he did. Napoleon's charm, power, and status made him irresistible to many women, and he didn't hesitate to pursue them. From ladies of the court to the wives of his officers and even casual acquaintances, Napoleon threw himself into a string of affairs. His romantic escapades weren't just about passion, they were also a way to reclaim control, and perhaps even settle the score with Josephine. But among these relationships, one stands out: his affair with Marie Walewska, a young Polish noblewoman whose beauty and intelligence captured his attention, and whose patriotism aligned with his political ambitions. Marie Walewska's story is the stuff of historical drama. Born into a noble Polish family, she was married off at the tender age of 16 to a man 51 years her senior, a wealthy and influential count. Despite her youth, Marie was intelligent, passionate, and deeply patriotic. She longed for a free Poland, a country that had been carved up and dominated by the great powers of Europe. By 1806, Napoleon had emerged as a potential savior for the Polish cause. He was advancing through Europe, and many Poles saw him as the man who could restore their nation's independence. Among them was Marie's husband, who concocted a bold plan. He urged Marie to use her beauty and charm to win Napoleon's support for Poland. When Marie met Napoleon, the sparks flew immediately. She was captivating, graceful, intelligent, and by all accounts, stunningly beautiful. For his part, Napoleon was utterly smitten, and it didn't take much persuasion for him to take an interest in her, and in Poland's plight. Marie and Napoleon's affair was far more than a fleeting romance. Though it began with political intent, it soon became deeply personal. Marie admired Napoleon's charisma and power, while Napoleon was drawn to her youthful vitality and patriotism. Their relationship blossomed during his campaigns, and it wasn't just about private moments of intimacy. Marie became a symbol of hope for Poland, a bridge between her people's aspirations and Napoleon's ambitions. The Polish nobility hoped that their relationship would secure Napoleon's commitment to their cause, and for a time, it seemed to work. Napoleon did take steps to support Poland, establishing the Duchy of Warsaw in 1807 as a semi-independent state under his protection. But despite the romance and shared ideals, their relationship was fraught with challenges. Napoleon's priorities lay with his empire, and his ambitions often overshadowed his personal connections. As much as Marie loved him, and it's said she truly did, she was acutely aware of the political nature of their bond. It's the autumn of 1809, and Napoleon receives life-altering news. Marie Walewska, the Polish noblewoman with whom he shared a passionate affair, is pregnant. For Napoleon, this revelation was both a jolt and a moment of profound clarity. Here was a man who had spent years fearing he might be sterile. His marriage to Josephine had produced no children, and with each passing year, the pressure mounted. Napoleon needed an heir, not just to secure his legacy, but to solidify the stability of his empire. And now, Marie's pregnancy proved that he wasn't the problem. Josephine was. This wasn't just personal, it was political. France needed an heir. Napoleon needed an heir. And suddenly, the question of his marriage became unavoidable. Napoleon and Josephine's relationship had always been complicated, filled with passion, betrayal, and reconciliation. But this was different. Napoleon adored Josephine in his own way, but her inability to bear him a child was no longer just a private matter. It was a matter of state. On December 15, 1809, the divorce became official. It was a dramatic and emotional moment. Josephine, ever the pragmatist, acknowledged the truth. She could not provide Napoleon with the heir he needed, and France's interests had to come before her own desires. In a final act of devotion, she offered him what she called her greatest gift, her consent to the separation. Imagine the scene, Napoleon and Josephine surrounded by their court announcing the end of their marriage. Both were in tears. Josephine reportedly fainted during the proceedings, and Napoleon was visibly shaken. Despite their differences, there was a deep bond between them, and this decision marked the end of a tumultuous but iconic chapter in both their lives. So you might be wondering, why didn't Napoleon marry Marie Walewska, the woman who had just proven she could give him the child he so desperately needed? The answer lies in Napoleon's vision of his empire and his sense of propriety. Marie was already married, and in Napoleon's eyes, a woman with such a status couldn't become the mother of a legitimate heir to the French throne. He needed more than a son. He needed an alliance. Napoleon's gaze turned toward Europe's royal families. If he couldn't strengthen his lineage through Josephine or Marie, he would do so through a marriage that would bring him closer to the dynasties he sought to rival. His choice? Archduchess Marie Louise of Austria, the daughter of Emperor Francis I of Austria and the great-niece of Marie Antoinette. She's young, regal, and most importantly, the daughter of Emperor Francis I of Austria, one of Napoleon's former enemies. Their union wasn't born of romance, but of strategy. By marrying into the Austrian Habsburg dynasty, Napoleon hoped to legitimize his rule and build bridges with one of Europe's most influential royal houses. But here's the twist. Napoleon wasn't even present for the wedding. Instead, the couple was married by proxy, a common practice among royals at the time. It was a symbolic ceremony, and though the ink was barely dry on the marriage certificate, the real moment of intrigue came when Napoleon and Marie Louise finally met in person. Just weeks after the proxy wedding, Napoleon met his new bride. And surprise, things went remarkably well. Despite their significant age difference and the political nature of their marriage, Marie Louise and Napoleon reportedly got along quite well. Marie Louise even wrote to her father, expressing her contentment with her new husband. It might have been partially diplomatic. After all, her father had orchestrated this marriage. But there's evidence to suggest that she genuinely admired Napoleon. For his part, Napoleon treated Marie Louise with respect and warmth, perhaps keen to make this union work after the emotional toll of his divorce from Josephine. Fast forward a year to March 1811, and Napoleon finally received the news he'd been waiting for. Marie Louise had given birth to a son. The boy was named François Charles Joseph Bonaparte, but he was better known by his grand title, the King of Rome. For Napoleon, this was the culmination of years of longing and uncertainty. The birth of an heir wasn't just a personal victory, it was a moment of triumph for the empire. This child symbolized continuity, stability, and the promise of a Bonaparte dynasty that could endure for generations. The French court erupted in celebrations. Cannons fired, bells rang, and across the empire, people toasted to the health of the newborn prince. Napoleon, ever the showman, ensured that this birth was treated as a monumental event. It wasn't just the arrival of a child, it was the birth of a legacy. While their marriage began as a political arrangement, Marie Louise quickly proved herself to be more than just a pawn in Napoleon's game of empire building. She adapted to her role as Empress with grace, and her youth brought a certain freshness to the French court. Some historians argue that their marriage was genuinely happy, at least in the beginning. Marie Louise gave Napoleon the stability and support he craved, and she seemed content in her new role. It's worth noting that she rarely involved herself in politics, focusing instead on her duties as a wife and mother, a stark contrast to the charismatic and politically astute Josephine. Of course, we can't talk about this period without mentioning Marie Walewska, Napoleon's Polish mistress who was carrying his child at the same time. Just 2 months after Napoleon married Marie Louise, Walewska gave birth to a son, Alexander Walewski. This parallel storyline adds a layer of complexity to Napoleon's life. While he had chosen Marie Louise as his wife and the mother of his legitimate heir, his relationship with Walewska remained a poignant reminder of his personal passions and his connection to Poland's struggle for independence. When Napoleon married Marie Louise in 1810, he wasn't just gaining a young and noble bride, he was securing a monumental political victory. The Habsburgs, the ruling dynasty of Austria, were among the oldest and most revered families in Europe. By marrying into their lineage, Napoleon wasn't just legitimizing his rule, he was stepping into the exclusive club of Europe's great dynasties. This alliance sent a powerful message. No longer was Napoleon the Corsican upstart, the outsider who seized power in revolutionary chaos. Now he was family, linked by blood to one of the most established monarchies on the continent. But Napoleon was never one to rest on his laurels. This marriage wasn't just about personal prestige, it was a calculated move to stabilize his empire. By aligning himself with Austria, a former adversary, Napoleon believed he could secure peace and consolidate his power across Europe. Unfortunately for Napoleon, blood ties weren't enough to guarantee loyalty. Just 2 years after the marriage, Austria turned against him. By 1812, the political climate had shifted, and Austria once again joined a coalition to oppose Napoleon. This betrayal was a harbinger of what was to come. Napoleon's once mighty empire was beginning to show cracks. His military and political strategies, which had seemed unstoppable, were starting to falter. One of Napoleon's greatest frustrations was Britain. The island nation had proved unyielding, refusing to bow to French dominance. To cripple Britain, Napoleon imposed the Continental system, a trade embargo designed to cut Britain off from European markets. In theory, it was a brilliant strategy. In practice, a disaster. The blockade devastated the economies of France and its allies far more than it hurt Britain. Smuggling flourished, resentment grew, and the strain on Napoleon's empire deepened. Nowhere was the unraveling of Napoleon's empire more evident than in Spain. In 1808, Napoleon made the fateful decision to depose the Spanish king and install his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne. Joseph didn't want the job. He knew it was a poisoned chalice. But Napoleon insisted. To Napoleon, Spain was a strategic prize, a key piece in his vision of a unified Europe under French control. What Napoleon failed to anticipate was the fierce resistance of the Spanish people. The deeply Catholic Spaniards viewed the French as unwelcome occupiers. They resented Napoleon's reforms, which curtailed the power of the Church, abolished the Inquisition, and introduced laws like divorce, which clashed with their traditions. The resistance wasn't limited to the battlefield. Spanish guerrilla fighters waged a brutal campaign against French forces. French governors were assassinated, and in Madrid, the bodies of French soldiers were gruesomely displayed hanging from lampposts, a stark warning to the occupiers. Desperate to expel the French, the Spanish called on Britain for help. Led by Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, British forces landed in Spain and joined the fight. Austria, emboldened by the resistance in Spain, also re-entered the fray. What followed was a slow but steady rollback of French dominance. The Peninsular War became a grinding conflict, sapping Napoleon's resources and morale. For the first time, the French army, once thought invincible, was being pushed back. Let's set the stage. By 1812, Napoleon was at the height of his power, ruling a vast empire that stretched from Spain to Poland. But cracks were forming, and one of the deepest fissures lay to the east, in Russia. Napoleon's Continental system, a trade blockade designed to strangle Britain economically, was a key point of tension. Tsar Alexander I, ruler of Russia, was not thrilled with this arrangement. For Russia, the blockade hurt more than it helped, crippling its economy by cutting off lucrative trade with Britain. Then there was Poland, a perpetual thorn in Russian pride. Napoleon's support for a semi-independent Poland was a direct challenge to Russian authority in Eastern Europe. To the Tsar, this wasn't just a political inconvenience, it was a provocation. The rift between Napoleon and Alexander I grew until, inevitably, it snapped. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon decided to resolve the conflict the only way he knew, by marching his Grande Armée, a staggering force of 600,000 men, into Russia. Napoleon's plan seemed invincible on paper. The Grande Armée was the largest force Europe had ever seen, a multinational coalition of soldiers from across the empire. Napoleon believed that one decisive campaign could bring Russia to its knees, forcing Alexander to negotiate. But Russia had other plans. Tsar Alexander and his generals refused to engage Napoleon in a traditional pitched battle. Instead, they adopted a strategy of retreat and scorched earth. As the French advanced, the Russians pulled back, destroying everything in their path, villages, crops, even wells, leaving nothing for Napoleon's troops to use. The Grande Armée, far from its supply lines, began to face shortages of food and water. Napoleon finally got his battle at Borodino in September 1812, just outside Moscow. It was a brutal and bloody affair, with tens of thousands killed on both sides. While Napoleon claimed victory, it was a hollow one. The Russian army retreated, but it wasn't broken. And worse, Moscow lay ahead, but it was a trap. On September 14th, Napoleon's forces entered Moscow, expecting a triumphant occupation. Instead, they found a city eerily abandoned. The Russians had evacuated, and shortly after the French arrived, fires broke out, consuming much of the city. Whether the fires were set by Russian saboteurs or accidental, the result was the same. Moscow, the prize Napoleon had hoped would force Tsar Alexander to surrender, was in ashes. Napoleon waited for weeks, hoping the Tsar would sue for peace. But Alexander didn't flinch. His refusal to negotiate left Napoleon with no choice but to retreat. And then, the true nightmare began. The retreat from Moscow is the stuff of legend, and not in a good way. As the French began their long march back in October, the Russian winter arrived with a vengeance. Temperatures plummeted, supplies ran out, and the Grande Armée faced relentless harassment from Russian forces and partisan fighters. Starvation, disease, and frostbite took a devastating toll. The image of soldiers wrapping their hands in rags to stave off frostbite or eating their horses just to survive paints a haunting picture. Entire units dissolved into chaos, and discipline collapsed. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée crossed the Berezina River in November, Napoleon's mighty force had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Of the 600,000 men who had marched into Russia, over 500,000 were dead, captured, or missing. Picture it, the once mighty Grande Armée, now a battered and ragged shadow of itself, limping back into Paris after the catastrophic Russian campaign. The winter of 1812 had been brutal, but the years that followed were even worse for Napoleon. His European enemies, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain, had united in a fierce coalition, determined to finish what Russia's winter had started. When Napoleon returned to the French capital in 1814, he found a city not welcoming its hero, but recoiling in disbelief and disappointment. The glory days were gone. The victories at Austerlitz, Jena, and Friedland felt like distant memories. The French people, worn out by years of war and loss, had begun to lose faith in their emperor. Worse, the Royalists, those who wanted to restore the Bourbon monarchy, were gaining momentum. They sensed weakness in Napoleon, and they weren't wrong. By March 1814, the coalition forces were closing in on Paris. On March 30th, the city faced an all-out assault. The enemy forces, a mix of Russian, Austrian, and Prussian troops, bombarded the French capital, bringing the war to the doorstep of Napoleon's empire. Napoleon, fighting valiantly in the field, was too far from Paris to stop the attack. His marshals, once his loyal and brilliant commanders, began to question his judgment. The invincible Napoleon now seemed mortal and vulnerable. As the spring of 1814 arrived, Napoleon's world crumbled. His closest allies began to desert him. The very marshals who had once marched with him to glory, men like Ney, Marmont, and Berthier, now urged him to surrender. They saw the writing on the wall. France was exhausted, its armies depleted, and its people weary of endless war. The ultimate betrayal, however, came not from his generals, but from his own family. His wife, Marie Louise, took their young son, Napoleon's beloved heir, and returned to Austria. They would never reunite. The dream of a Napoleonic dynasty was shattered. For Napoleon, the heartbreak of this personal loss was almost as devastating as the collapse of his empire. He had always envisioned his son carrying on his legacy, but now that vision was slipping away. Facing no other choice, Napoleon abdicated the throne on April 11, 1814. It was a moment of profound humiliation for the man who had once ruled over most of Europe, and yet even in defeat, Napoleon's charisma didn't entirely fade. The coalition powers allowed him to retain the title of emperor and granted him a small domain to rule over, the Mediterranean island of Elba. But make no mistake, this wasn't a glamorous retirement. Elba, though picturesque, was a tiny island far removed from the grandeur of Paris and the sprawling empire he had once commanded. Napoleon's journey to Elba was a public spectacle. The once great emperor, who had stood on the battlefields of Europe as a giant, now traveled as a defeated man. His departure was met with a mix of jeers and cheers, depending on who you asked. Still, Napoleon's spirit was far from broken. He began to rebuild a life on Elba, reorganizing the island's administration, and even planning public works projects. But anyone who knew Napoleon knew this. Exile wouldn't keep him down for long. Though Napoleon's reign had ended, his story was far from over. He may have been removed from power, but he wasn't finished with Europe yet. The 100 Days and the final dramatic chapter of his life were just around the corner. Join us next time as we explore Napoleon's daring escape from Elba, his triumphant return to France, and his ultimate showdown at Waterloo. The Emperor's flame may have dimmed, but it had not yet been extinguished. Thank you for now. See you next time.